So what I'm going to talk to you tonight a bit about is the concept of being a jack of all trades and a master of none in the coaching world. And the reason that I say that is often we're expected to know a lot about lots of different things in terms of different positions, different formations, different areas when it comes to, psychology, strength and conditioning, fitness, periodization, different tactics, different formations, systems, etc. Different areas of man management. And one day I was watching Mastermind and I did just sit down and thought, what would be my specialist subject? And I think that would be a key consideration for everybody moving forward. And it frames the basis of tonight is, if you were sitting in the chair, what would be your specialist subject? What would be the superpower that you have, if you like, as a coach, as somebody either who works in professional football or who wants to work in professional football? So that would be the way that I would frame it from now or moving forward. The area that I've looked at is working with forwards tonight. And I'm not saying that I'm an expert in this area. What I am saying is I've given it a lot of thought to work towards being an expert in this area. And I'll go backwards to sort of go as to why that's the case in a little while. But that is the one thing that I would like you to consider in a minute. It's not about me being an expert in this area. It's just to say that I've done a little bit more research than some people might have done in this area. And I'm going to share some of that insight. And then the question to you towards the end of it, if you like, is, well, so what? What does it mean for you as an individual? What does it mean for your future? Maybe as a coach, if you're a young coach starting out, what does it mean for you in the environment that you work in, or maybe where you want to work later on? So with that in mind, I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what we're going to discuss. So a little bit around data, data taken from different areas. So one will be the Premiership from 1920 season, top and bottom of the Premiership, so teams that won it, teams that got relegated. Look at some data from the Champions League, some information that sort of influenced my decision to look at this moving forward from the World Cup 2018, and then give you an opportunity in the breakout rooms, as we've done previously, to discuss it in a little bit of detail, where you can go off and share it in small groups. That's the plan over the next sort of hour and a half. If you wouldn't mind, it'd be great if you could either subscribe on YouTube, and I know I keep saying it, but we just want to, or I want to try and get as much exposure out for some of the ideas that we've got going on. We've had some brilliant delivery from Mark Haining, from Simon Millington, from Mark Carter. Hopefully you've enjoyed those, and we'll get some more of those out there. And keep feeding back and keep sharing, because some of the concepts are not what you would traditionally come across on a coach education course. And then tonight, if you don't mind, send a tweet or drop me an email afterwards and let me know what you think or what you thought of it, and maybe how we could make things a little bit better. So the first question tonight that I'm going to ask you to put in the chat box is, I'd like you to think about and actually think about this word. Take a few seconds to think about it. But what's your favorite word and why? And I'm going to share mine with you. But what is your favorite word, and why is it your favorite word? Just pop something in the chat box. We've got a few coming in. So why, respect. Evening to everyone that said hello. Discipline. Good, keep them coming in. Yeah, perspective. CAD, Robert, can you type that in there and go in a little bit more detail as to what that is? Team, humble. So we've got some good. We've got some words coming in. How from Jimmy, it's good. I like that. So we've got some interesting words coming in, quite short. And Miles has gone inclusivity. All right, good. Now I'm going to go through my one in relation to tonight's topic, and I'm going to refer back to some of those words as we go later on. But the reason behind my word, I'll give you the rationale for it, is it's one that I use every day when I'm talking to coaches. So my day job now is I talk to coaches on their undergraduate degree, and I do some tutoring as well on the side. And the word that I like to use, or my favorite word, is considered. So when I'm talking to coaches, I like to ask them, well, what is it you've considered in this process? I like to try and get an insight into what it is that they've thought about, or that maybe the bits that they haven't thought about throughout the process, and maybe even offer up some considerations myself moving forward. So that's the reason why I like that word. And I'm going to ask you, by the end of tonight, if you were the owner of a Premiership club, because again, this is aimed at the elite male professional game. If you were the owner of a professional club and you heard some of the information that was put forward tonight, would you consider hiring a position-specific expert, potentially, rather than firing the manager? Now, the reason I say that is, when you fire the manager, a bit like what Sheffield United have done recently, you've still got the same players to work with. You haven't really gone in and fixed the problem. The problem is really around, letting in goals, but tonight's focus is going to be around scoring goals. So just by getting rid of the manager, you've still got the same ingredients to work with. You're not necessarily going to change things massively because of the type of player that you've got. So maybe you might look at investing some of that money that you would potentially use for sacking a manager or redeploying them. You might look at using that money to invest in an additional member of staff, somebody who's an expert in their field. Now, the reason I say that is we've gone for years and years and years with position-specific experts who have been coached to keep the ball out of the net. So why haven't we gone the other way and sought to try and solve that problem? Goalkeeping coaching gets a lot of resources in terms of staffing, in terms of analytics, but scoring goals doesn't get the same level of detail. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. So in terms of the picture that you see here, one of you will probably pick up that, you might look in the middle of the screen, you see somebody maybe reading a match report or a player report, or it could be there's a tactics board discussion going on in the bottom corner. And this could be a picture that would resemble any sort of grassroots football club. But essentially, the question that often comes up, and somebody raised it earlier, which is good, and I wanted to see if that word would come up. We always look at the word why, or the word why is used quite a lot in coaching context now, and it's easy for us to use it to justify our rationale for what we're doing or why we're doing something. So the question that I would pose if I was in the situation of a manager who was going in to maybe conduct an audit of a Premier League company, a Premier League football club, would be, well, why wouldn't you? Why not have an expert? Because the amount of resources that are put towards strength and conditioning coaches, analysts now becoming a bigger and bigger factor in terms of club staffing and resources. Why not have somebody who would potentially be a leading expert in their field? So having the big picture is something that we should be focused on. And I mean a bigger picture rather than quite a narrow focus. And when we're talking about working in teams and multidisciplinary teams across a club, sometimes the narrow focus is the team. We're not necessarily going the bigger picture and looking at actually individuals that make up the team and their individual aspects, their individual skills that they have, the attributes that they come with, and also coaching them, going into the nitty-gritty and actually coaching somebody, even if they've been playing as a professional in the Premier League for 10 years, on how to finish properly. The rationale for me sort of wanting to share some of these ideas came from a colleague who I used to work with at the FA. And we were talking about a former striker that we'd both seen work, Ian Wright. And Ian Wright, before each game at Arsenal, and then when he went to West Ham, where my colleague was playing, Ian Wright, before the game, would hit maybe 60 to 100 shots. And he would do it right foot half volley, just from 6 to 10, 12 yards, right foot half volley, and he'd have 15 of those low, and then he'd have low ones across the goal, low ones near post. Then he'd go touch on the fight and volley. And all of this would happen before a game, sometimes with a goalkeeper, sometimes without a goalkeeper, depending on if there was one available, if they were doing their own bit of work. He would often go off and just work on little short range finishes. The analogy that or the comparison you might have then would be somebody like Tiger Woods. So Tiger Woods has been documented through his pre-game warm-up as taking 10 putts from distance, but 51 putts from close range, from around about 4 to 8 feet. And the whole reason behind it is the psychology element. And that is a key consideration with the work that we're doing today. So I'm not going to say it's all technical and tactical that we have to look at, because it does link to other areas, other fields. but the psychology behind being able to hear the net was really important for Ian Wright, and he used to talk about that. And the psychology for players like Tiger Woods, being able to see the ball travel into the hole over and over and hear the noise of the ball hitting the bottom of the cup is important. But when you go watch lots of teams work and teams train, that's exactly what they do. They play as a team, and they don't necessarily look at, well, what is the role function of this specific individual on match day? And for somebody like Ian Wright, or players that play up front, it's important that we then look at, well, their job is to score goals. So let's give them the opportunity to score as many possible goals as we can in the warm-up, linked to the areas of the pitch that is going to happen. But equally, get them warm, because those players can get warm in that environment. So when we look at the reasons why some of these things take place or don't take place, there is a key question. So the question that I would pose to you now as a collective, if I'd ask you to stick it in the chat box again, and I'm going to look, because I've got a list of answers, but what is it that informs your practice? Why do you do what you do? So put your answer in the chat box, because I think that is an interesting one. Why do you do what you do when it comes to session design and how you coach? So habit might be one, yeah, Brian. So research and experience is another one. So player development, yeah, development comes into it. So maybe how you were taught, your own observations. So modeling, seeing other people work. There's lots of these. So essentials of the position profile. And we'll go through some of the profiling. I've got some stuff to share with you around that. So maybe linked to a philosophy. So player context. Okay, good. So we've got some ideas as to why we might do what we do. So in terms of one that doesn't normally come up, or stuff that doesn't always come up from my experience, and this is, through recent examples of going to watch coaches work in their own environment, in situ, is evidence. So adopting an evidence-based approach. People can often justify why they're doing what they're doing, but actually citing evidence or being able to cite sources of evidence or even use that on their session plans is really interesting. So when I have seen it done, I've actually found it quite inspiring and gone away, and it's led to some really good and interesting discussions. So that is a key consideration for us today, because the focus of my work that I'm going to share with you today is around evidence. Some of it will be linked to modern trends, and then some of it might be linked to some numerical data that might be useful for some of you. And like I said, that's all it is. It's just data. It's then how you decide to use that data. Interestingly, on lots of coach education courses, you don't necessarily see resources being used or numbers being used that have already been generated by those organizations. And the one that I would say that, or some of the resources that are really useful at the minute, are the UEFA technical reports. And I'll share the link to those with you in a little while, because they have proved to be quite an insightful starting point for me when I was looking up some of these resources I'm going to share with you tonight. So where it all started for me was, in terms of the numbers, was around the World Cup 2018. I wanted to look at what the best teams were doing. I think that was a key bit. And then if you look at what teams, the two teams that got to the final and ultimately the winners did, it was really interesting to compare and contrast in terms of the area that they play in. So how far away they are from the goal when they're attacking, how far away they are from the goal when they defend on average over a tournament. Defensively, if you have, I mean, you can see the numbers yourselves, but if you look at defensively how they set up, very, very similar. So you should be able to see that. I see a couple of you zooming in. But all of this information is available in the World Cup report. The one thing that did stand out to me, though, was the goals element of the successful teams in the tournament. So, for example, when I compared the teams that got to the final four, one of the things that stood out for me was England's lack of goals from open play. So 75% of England's goals came from set pieces. And it was completely the opposite way round with Belgium, France, and Croatia ultimately. So that was quite a big factor. So then when I started to look into it a little bit more, then I started to consider, well, whereabouts did those goals that came from open play come from? And it started to intrigue me. And then I remembered I had a resource on file from Dick Bate, the late great Dick Bate, who unfortunately I didn't get to see his position-specific course. I went on the Developing Defenders course, and it was absolutely fantastic. But Dick Bate put together an amazing piece of work years ago around the position-specific course for forwards, and there's some really interesting data, and I've got a little bit of comparative data from that tonight. When I send out the newsletter, I will send you a link to his anthology, which is remarkable. For £25, I mean, you can get the man's life work in one document, and it's probably the best £25 in terms of coaching that you're probably going to spend. So I started to look into repetition and drilling down on little bits, and that could be in possession and out of possession, what it actually meant. And then I started to consider some of the things that I'd learned from Dick Bate on that course, and he broke the area down really in terms of, or the player down in terms of 3 different areas. It was what they do in terms of movement, how do they have their role function within the team, and what is their individual job in terms of, the actions that they might do over and over within a game. So I started to have a look at Arjen Robben, and for any of you that have seen his clips on Twitter, they're unbelievable in the Champions League video clips, but it's what he does day in, day out, and he would practice it over and over and over, and he was excellent at doing it. And we hear a lot about the 3 R's in terms of realism, relevance, and repetition. The one thing we don't always see too much of when it comes to forwards is repetition. Now, you might find that sounds a little bit crazy, but if you're talking about practices where goals are scored, and we'll get to that bit in a key bit in terms of the area, in terms of pitch geography, the majority of goals are scored within 6 to 12 yards, but lots of the practices that we see around finishing don't necessarily resemble that. They do resemble other elements when it comes to the number of touches that players are encouraged to take, or conditions or restrictions that are put on players. But the practices themselves often don't take place within real small areas quite close to goal, almost giving the goalkeeper no chance. And that's a key bit within the session design. So moving forward, the question I would ask from you based on your practice design is, well, so what? So what does this mean for me in terms of my 9, my 10, my 7, my 11, if you've got them inverted, if you play a 4-3-2-1, there are loads of different ways of playing it, but the question for you should be, what does it mean for me, and how can I go away and turn this into usable information? Because that's all it is at the minute. It's just usable information. So I started to look at how you might go about using different practices to enhance players being able to do what Arjen Robben does, for example. So Arjen Robben's efficiency from cutting in from the right-hand side onto his left foot and scoring goals, there aren't too many that go ahead of him in terms of the stats. But what we would say is, then you need to start looking at, well, what are the little details that go in between just the stats and the training practices that go on. So I've got a video clip for you that I'd like to share, and it's only about 35-40 seconds long, but it was a conversation between Laetitia and Gary Neville. And Gary Neville notices one tiny detail around the techniques, or the variation in techniques that are used within striking the ball.
Again, this one similar to the Aston Villa one, really, from maybe a little bit further out, but just a really good strike, which I started hitting straight at Oggy in goal, and about halfway through its flight, it just starts taking the bend. And it's just wrong-footed.
More power on that one, more laces than the other one. The other one seems to be more. Was it same? Is it same technique?
Yeah, almost. Yeah. So there was well spotted actually. Not a lot of people noticed that. So the first 2 were more side foot. Yeah. That one was kind of driven a little bit more with the laces a little bit, but still with a little bit of side foot in it, but not as much as the other 2. Very perceptive of you guys. I'm impressed. Yeah, and this is the last.
So the key consideration for you is, as a coach, almost as an analyst, and when you're watching the game moving forward, is, well, what does that mean for me and the players that I work with? So one of the things that I started to think about was the early influences in my coaching journey, and the real value and rigor that went into knowing the technical detail to develop players, to be able to notice small little details like that, to be able to help them have a variety. And we always talk about the toolbox, but have a variety of tools in the toolbox. So when I did my level 2 years ago, we were talking, and I've still got some of the notes, but we were talking about striking the ball moving away from you, striking the ball coming towards you, and striking the ball coming across you. And those were some of the things, types of strikes there that you could go off and you could work with your players depending on their need, to go off and refine those. And that was just with your forwards. They would often be not only on the floor, but some of them would be in the air. Some of them might be a little bit of both, if you like, the half volley that potentially would sit in between. Some of them might be on the bounce, where you're talking about the ball going away from you on the half volley on the bounce, depending on your definition of a half volley, or coming towards you on the bounce, and getting used to being able to adjust your feet a bit like Shay Adams did on the weekend. So it then comes down to, well, practice design, and how do you then mimic those within your training session? How do you get lots and lots of repetition in there? It's not easy to design sessions that allow you to get loads and loads of shots in there. Part of the rationale for wanting to share this again was I've been to a couple of different international camps, very fortunate to be able to go and see a couple of these in practice. And I went to watch one, and when I spoke to the coach of the team, they said it was a finishing session. So brilliant. So I've got my notepad out and I'm sitting down and I'm taking my notes. And after a couple of minutes, I started to do a tally chart in terms of the number of passes compared to the number of shots that the forwards were taking within the session. Because although it was labeled as a finishing session, it didn't resemble a finishing session. It looked like a keep ball session or a passing session. So in the end, by the end of the 12 minutes that they'd had, the forwards had 2 shots and they'd made 24 passes each. There were 2 of them, one at each end of the pitch. So it did really baffle me in terms of, and in that time they hadn't scored a goal each, either of them. It did baffle me in terms of how it could be labelled as a finishing session. If we don't get better at practicing or designing our sessions that allow finishing to take place, how are they ever going to become better finishers? Now, that is something that we should be looking at as coaches, and actually really providing a framework where players are getting not only learning how to finish, but actually being taught how to finish. So a couple of the examples that I cited at lunch when I spoke to the coach afterwards was around the crossing practice that they were using, and the information that was given to the players or not given to the players, which really, in my opinion, would have helped. So the ball came in and the players kept trying to volley it and smash it really hard. And I asked the question, why aren't they being taught just, to have a shorter backswing, or, change the surface that they're trying to use, or let it run across the body if we're talking about a volley, so that they're then using the other foot, so the angle of the goal opens up and they've got a larger target to hit rather than taking it on the near foot. And the response back was, that's what they should be getting at their club. So I asked the question, well, do they get it at their club? And I don't know, was the response back. When you talk about international managers who were saying, well, that's not necessarily my role within working with these players. And if those players are not getting at international level, when you've got them and you can do some of that individual work, and then potentially through discussions I've had with other people that work within the elite male professional game, they're not getting it in the club at first team level. When are these players ever going to learn? Because some of them still need to learn. It can't just be expected that it's going to happen overnight. So we do sometimes need to revisit the fundamentals and the brilliant basics, even with the best players. Sometimes things do get learned. An example here that we might talk about is, maybe through street play or street football, or games that you might be able to include in your sessions, like World Cup, in terms of being able to dribble at people and take people on and get lots of repetition. Some of it might be headers and volleys that you'd be aware of. Some of you may call it sort of 60 seconds or 66 if you're from South London, where you're trying to score headers and volleys against the clock. Other ones might just be little games where you've got 1v1s and 2v2s going on in the schoolyard, if you like. An example of that is a video that was a clip that's taken from Luis Suarez. So I'm going to share this one, but the history of this clip goes back a long time before the weekend, when it was just one of those goals where people were in awe of in terms of how he finished it. Now, I've never seen a coach step in and coach this finish or this particular finish, and when you look at the key factors of a straight approach, but it will become evident now. Yeah, although that finish has been around for years, as you can see with Tino Spria, and I've been around for a long time coaching, there's not too many instances where I've been observing coaches at all different levels where I've seen people step in and coach that type of finish, even though it's on. So it is important that we sometimes go in and we actually teach certain things, certain aspects, rather than hope that learning is going to take place. So that is just one thing I'd like you to consider moving forward. Like I said, it's that word that I like, consider, not necessarily buy into it wholeheartedly, but take on board that we might need to step in and actually coach based on the demands of the game, because that does happen. And even like Lamella's goal that we saw the other day, there are times, not too frequently, but there are times when the unorthodox might be the best option, especially when it comes to finishing. So the goals that we're going to look at today are sort of in 3 areas. They're inside the box, outside the box, and inside the 6-yard box. Those are the key ones that we're going to look at. There are others that were scored from set plays, but I'll have a different set of research around set plays and their importance that I'm currently working on to share some ideas on, because there was too much, so I need to split it all up. So those are the goals that we're going to look at. The goals are from the Premier League, and they are the last 100 goals taken over a specific period of time. So they were from, let me just make sure I get the date right. So they were from the 13th of February to the 7th of March. So it doesn't include like Man City's route the other day, post that game and onwards. So that is something to consider. Now, when you see this map, these were 100 goals that were scored in the Premier League. I'll run through what the color code is, but the yellows were 1-touch finishes. The blues were 2-touch finishes. The black dots were 3-touch finishes or more. The green ones that you can see outside the area, they were free kicks that were scored, and the red ones were own goals. So it is really important that we start to get an idea of, well, what does that actually mean? When you see that as a heat map in terms of the Premier League, you can tell quite categorically where the goals are being scored from and how they're being scored, hopefully by the color coding. But to break it down a little bit further for you, what I did was I used some percentages, which I thought might make it a little bit clearer. So in terms of the data that was gathered, there is a significant change over a period of years, but in one key area. So the area where the data has changed is in relation to the 2009-2010 season, which is when I mentioned about Dick Bates' work, where the level of detail in terms of the analysis from the position-specific course was top drawer, is outside the area. So that is where the game has changed. Now, part of that is down to how build-up is taking place, and part of it is also down to teams playing out from the back and sometimes possession being lost higher up the pitch, and then teams scoring from that. But that is quite a significant change, or from that 100 goals that I've looked at there. Now, I don't know what that might look like over a whole season, but that is one thing that we could consider moving forward as an area that might require further investigation. Now, it's not just about that one season and looking back 2009, 2010 and thinking that was an area. There are some really important other bits of evidence that would go with that. So, for example, I'll give it Watford in the season didn't score a single goal in the 2019 season, 2019-2020 season. Outside the area, they scored all 36 of their goals inside the penalty box, every single one of them. And we can talk a little bit about that when we get to that part of the presentation. But there is definitely a change in terms of where the goals are being scored overall in central areas. So that's what the data says from that collection point. Now, in terms of the goal, where the ball is going in the goal, it was quite interesting in terms of mapping it all out. But again, the data was very similar to what Dick Bate had prepared from his work. So circa 80% is below the midline of the goal. Now that is quite a significant factor when it comes to our session design and how we go about helping our players finish at the highest level and what they should be aiming for. Comparatively, so data from the women's WSL was massively different in the 2017-18 season, where if you got the ball high to the goalkeeper's left, there was a 48, if it was on target, there was a 48% conversion rate. So, almost 1 in 2 shots high to the left went in. So it was just, there is a massive difference. And that's why I've narrowed the focus for this work purely down to the elite men's game, because there's too much data to gather. Interestingly, though, only 2 free kicks scored. in the Premier League over those 100 goals. And you look at the amount of time that is afforded to players at the highest level professional clubs, where they're even working on set pieces within their club. And again, there were only 3 direct corners scored out of 100. There was one that was an indirect one with Chelsea and Werner, which would bring that set play up to 4. But 12 penalties during that time. 12 penalties were scored out of the 100 goals. Now, without going into too much detail and going through the proper analytics around the penalty taking aspect of the research, 10 of the 12 went down to the goalkeeper's right-hand side and were low. So only 2 went to the goalkeeper's left. So those are some things where you might look at, well, what does that mean for the players that I'm working with? And we might then start to have to go into to looking at, well, what does it look like to be able to strike the ball across your body? What elements of disguise are the players using? Because traditionally, the evidence would suggest, and there was some academic data that would back it up, that right-footed penalty takers would tend to go to the goalkeeper's left-hand side. So players are aware of that now. Right-footed players are aware of that, almost assuming that the goalkeepers know that information. So they're trying to trick them and play sort of mind games with them. So it is important we break down to where the balls are going in the net as well. So I started to have a look at the Premier League. I started to have a look at old World Cup reports, and then I started to look at the Champions League. And the reason for that was I just wanted as much information as I possibly could to see whether there are any similarities or any differences. So interestingly, in the Champions League, across 386 goals, only 5 goals were scored by a direct free kick. In the entire competition, and that includes players who you would expect to be up there with the best of them: Neymar, Messi, Ronaldo, all high-level players that you would think would be contributing more to that statistic in terms of increasing it. So my argument is, having been around environments where lots of professional players spend lots of time, either in training or after training, working on free kicks. For me, it's a waste of time. And I'm saying that sort of not completely in jest, but there are much better things that those players could be working on in terms of their conversion rates. So, for example, Kevin De Bruyne in the Premier League this year, does anyone want to hazard a guess in the chat box of what his conversion rate was after 28 games this season? Have a quick guess. Put something in the chat box and we'll see. So he took however many shots, scored however many. What was it in terms of percentage? No, for open play. Anyone hazard a guess? 5%, 5, 9. So we've got a variety. It's 100%. Must be a Manchester City fan. 15. Okay, good. So it was actually 4%. Right? So 4%. He was only converting 4% of his chances in terms of shots. Now there are lots of reasons that might go into it, and there are, reasons why. Those might be low, and it might be that City play against teams that tend to defend quite deep, and potentially there's lots of bodies in the way. So then you might argue, well, what do the practices look like that he's working on, him as an individual, because he's got the highest number of shots for City in the Premier League? Do they have loads of congestion? Is he having to fire things through people's legs or things that mirror people's legs and round objects? Or is it just the generic sort of practices what you would genuinely associate with finishing? So those are some of the bits where we try and link realism to what's actually happening, and the types of chances that a team would create, and the individuals within the team, the types of chances that they would be getting on the end of, because the types of chances do change. So there's a little bit of information there, but the key one really was that the Champions League had the highest number of goals that they've ever had. Part of it could come down to the tournament format, not entirely sure. It will be interesting to see what happens this year in comparison to the number of goals scored. So in terms of the Champions League, I then decided, well, let me look at the best team in there. I wanted to have a look at what Bayern Munich did over that tournament. And it was really quite fascinating in terms of a formula, because there is no formula for success. If it was, it would be really easy. We'd say to your team, take this number of shots, get this number on target, and you'll win X amount of games. It's not that easy, but it is interesting when you start going in and having a look at what they do and comparing it to some of the other teams. So then a little bit of a study report on Bayern. One thing is really noticeable in terms of the first 15 minutes of their games and how they go about their business and really trying to impose themselves on the opposition and have a real attacking mindset, both in and out of possession of the ball. And in 45% of their games, they score first. So they score in the first 15 minutes. That is a fascinating number when you look at what that means overall. So if you look at the big picture in the Champions League, 80% of teams that score the first goal don't lose. So that is a real key factor in terms of how they go about playing. The other bit that you notice when you watch them play is once they've gone a goal up, they tend to rest in possession for a little bit of time, and then they will go again. So they come in waves. And that's potentially why they score so many goals, 3.91 per goals per game, which is huge. And then you look at this season, this was over the tournament when they won it in 1920. You look at how they compare this year to, even some of the best teams like Barcelona. Barcelona's conversion rate at the minute is about 12.5%, whereas Bayern are scoring 20% of the shots that they take, which is absolutely monumental at that level of football. The other bit that you'll notice around Bayern is where their goals came from. So although the modern trend that we often have associated with modern trends in attacking play is around the role of the attacking fullback, Bayern actually didn't do that in terms of their fullbacks moving forward. So their job was to provide and make sure that they could defend the counter as well. So that was an interesting bit where they had no defenders score any goals for them. And also, if you look at defensively how they set up, they didn't concede a single goal from corners. So if you have an issue of defending corners, then there are a few teams, there are 9 teams in the competition that didn't concede a goal from set plays, and they all set up, in different ways based on the personnel that they've got. Leipzig have an interesting one that they use. Bayern have again a different one, but it's well worth looking at in terms of the technical report and the videos that are available for that. And I'll put all of that in the newsletter that comes out. But it is interesting when you start to go, well, what does it mean overall then? So overall, Champions League goals are up. That's a real simple graph that you can see. So they're going year on year. There was a dip in sort of 2018-19, but overall the rate is still high, and it is high compared to the Premier League. So the Premier League, we associate with being the best league in the world, but we are creating a lot of chances comparatively. Chances per game are in line with that of the Champions League. However, the conversion rate's not, because we don't have the same quality of players. Now, potentially that could be that we're not coaching the players to get to that level. We're not refining their technique. We're not doing enough when it comes to working with individuals and looking at practice design to enhance their potential to convert the chances that are being created. And how that links to teams and other aspects of your training sessions could also include little tips and tricks around duration on the ball and number of passes. So often when I've seen coaches work, what you would often see is, 10 passes equal this, and, you've got 5 seconds to do this. The actual numbers overall are roughly 4 passes equal on transition equal a goal, and doing that in under 13 seconds. So it's hitting the team quickly and quite directly when you get an opportunity to try and play forward, rather than let them get reorganized and have sustained long periods of possession. So when you are designing your practices, think about how long 13 seconds is and 4 passes when it comes to your players, and how you might go about doing something like that with your players in the environment that you work in. Because if you do want players to go on and play at the elite level and you want to coach at the elite level, we should know what the demands of the game are. And these are the demands from the very, very top. So we should be looking to learn from the information that's available. So I started to go into more detail around the individual teams within the competition, not just looking at the competition as a whole. So I started to look at the teams that won their domestic leagues across Europe and also competed in the Champions League. So those are some of the teams there, and you can see the key in the top right-hand corner. Interestingly, if you look at the teams that are getting more than 15 shots per game, you'll see it's the majority of them. So apart from Juventus and sort of PSG. PSG are an interesting one. So where Bayern Munich score early in their games, PSG scored more than 30% of their goals in the last 15 minutes of their game. So if you if you did want to work on that as an individual, it might be worth looking at how PSG set up their team strategically and how they apply pressure in the last 15 minutes of games, because a team that scores, 30% of their tournament goals in the last 15 minutes is a really interesting team for you to go away and have a look at as a research project, if that's an area that you would like to develop. The interesting bit when it comes to the conversion rates for these are the best teams in Europe, was the actual numbers in terms of how many shots they took to what that meant in terms of goal rate. So the best teams in Europe were only scoring 10% of the shots that they created. And to me, that number sounded crazy when you're talking about the best teams in Europe, not just the best finishers in Europe, but the best midfielders in Europe that would be contributing, or the best fullbacks that would be acting as support players in that process. So I went away and I started to have a look at, well, if that was what the best teams in Europe were doing, what were some of the teams, although they're in the best division, the top division in the country, what were the teams that got relegated? What were they doing? And I mentioned earlier that shots per game on average for those best teams was over 15 per game on the whole. But if you look at this infographic, what you'll see there is the majority of teams are sort of hovering around 10 shots a game, roughly 10, 11 shots a game. Then you start to look at, well, how many of those are on target? And it's roughly 3.5. Now, part of that will come down to shot location, which I'll get to in a second, but converting those sort of 10 or 11 shots into goals becomes a real issue if you're getting a lot less shots. So you're having less shots, you're potentially having them from a further out, and we'll go over that in a minute. It then becomes really difficult for you to convert that into a tangible asset that's going to allow you to win games and stay in the league, which is what cost all of these teams. So if you don't score goals, you won't stay in the league. And there is an old saying, some of you will have heard it before, I'm sure, but goals win games, defenses win championships. And I haven't done all the work on the defensive side of it yet, but there is definitely a correlation between staying in the league and the number of goals, the conversion rate. And I'll highlight that bit as we progress. So if the top teams are only scoring 10%, the teams that were getting relegated from the top divisions, they were only scoring 5% of the chances they were creating. So they were creating less chances and they were only scoring 5%. It's no wonder those teams went down. So this is the bit where I turn around and say, if I owned a Premier League club, potentially I would hire somebody to come in and look at it from a business perspective and ask from an auditing side of things, what could we do better? And I wouldn't be asking a businessman, I'd be asking somebody that works in football, somebody's a coach educator who could come in and say, look, you need to look at these are the stats, but this is the practice that's happening on your training field. And the reason I say that is we do it in academies, we audit academies, but there's no audit for senior multi-million-pound businesses. And clubs don't have an organization where they can go to and say, look, can you come in and help us? Rather than fire a manager, can you, for £10,000, come in and offer us some advice on a consultancy basis? Or, for £10,000 and one of your consultants who might be on, 40 grand a year for the rest of the year, can you come in and offer us some practical support in situ, the way you might do in a business? Because keep firing managers and coaches, it doesn't make any sense, because the players that you've got, unless they're going to be coached, they're still the same players. They're going to get the same number of chances, or likely the similar number of chances, and they're going to convert at a similar rate. They need to be coached. So from a business perspective, it would make sense to have position-specific experts, and almost what you might classify as a £50,000 lottery ticket if you're in the Premier League. And if I was a chairman of Norwich, Bournemouth, Watford, I think I would take that £50,000 gamble. But that's just me. And I'm sure if you ask Sheffield United fans or Sheffield United owners at the minute, they potentially would buy one of those tickets. But they were converting only 5% of the chances that they were creating, which was staggeringly low. So I started then to break it down, and then went for, instead of Europe, I had a look just at the Premier League, because it might be more relatable to the environment that I work in and the people that I work with, where they want to work. So I started to look at top 3 teams. So Liverpool won the league, and you had City and United, and then the teams that went down. And again, it's broken down into, so you can have a clear idea using the key sort of total number of shots per game on average that they would have, where they would take place, and then sort of inside and outside the area. So the top teams, obviously, they created more inside the penalty area. Now, part of that might be, if you go back to that image that I showed you from the World Cup, from France and Croatia, it's the distance between lines, and that could be in possession and out of possession, and playing further up the pitch. When you look at the heat map that Norwich provided, it was much deeper than those of the French and the Croatian teams. So I've only used Norwich as an example, but Norwich were about 5 meters deeper. That becomes a lot further when it comes to getting up the pitch, to be able to create those chances to get into the penalty area, where you've got, an increased chance of scoring, converting those chances that you are creating, the small number of chances that you are creating. So it's not just taking the shot and converting the shot is important. It's the other bits that go hand in hand with it. So the build-up play that would allow you to get better shot location. So across the top 3 and the bottom 3 teams in the league, this was where the shots took place as a whole. And I think it's fairly representative based on the other stats that I've looked at from different clubs. But from the top 3 and the bottom 3, what you'd see is 63% of shots roughly would be from inside the area, and then you've got a little bit of shots taking place inside the 6-yard box. More often than not, though, they would be from set plays or from cutbacks. Now, the big difference was when you isolate the teams that finished bottom of the league, what you find is quite a significant increase in shots from outside the area. So there was a 7% increase. So you're now getting less shots, but you're having more of your shots from distance. And again, I mentioned Watford earlier. Watford didn't score a single goal from outside the penalty area. Norwich only scored 2 over the entire season from outside the penalty area. So we could turn around and go, well, actually, it might be the fact that it's the team systems that we've got. But if your team is designed and your philosophy is to play a certain way, then perhaps you then need to look at your training or your practices that you're designing and delivering, or coaching points that you're giving to your players. Because if you are going to set that team up to play in a certain way, you are going to create a certain type of chance. And if you don't work on finishing that certain type of chance, the chances are you're not going to convert it. So it is really important that you do start to recognize, well, what type of chances are we going to create if we play a certain way, and then design your practices around it. And there's some interesting comparative data that I'll share with you around Harry Kane that you all have access to through the Premier League. But it is interesting when we start to go, well, if we do this as a team, what is it that we will get in return, and potentially what will we lose? So Watford were the example that I gave. They didn't score any from outside the area, whereas there were other teams that had some strengths in different areas. So one of them was Bournemouth. Bournemouth were really strong in terms of set plays. Fantastic. So if you want to learn how to score set plays, watch Bournemouth from the 1920 season, where they were 4th in the Premier League in terms of the number of goals that they scored from set plays. Fantastic free kicks and corners. They were very, very effective. But the big issue comes down to open play, goals in open play, scoring only 17 goals in open play. And I mentioned that about England. You will not win, you will not sustain success by struggling to score in open play. And you can have your team set up to play a certain way, but at one point you need to realize and you need to recognize we need to do something a little bit different. We need to change the way we look at things. And if we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. So it is something to consider moving forward. How then you go about recognizing when is the point within our practice that we go, enough's enough, let's try something a little bit different. And if you're looking at teams like Brighton, Fulham, Sheffield United, after 28 games, which is why I deliberately wanted to get to that period, that is a point when we should go, there's 30 points left. What can we do in order to maximize our chance to stay in the league? So that is something that that should be looked at if you're talking about what those clubs are doing now at this moment in time. So in terms of the types of chances created, and I've covered that a little bit, I then looked at, well, 2 players who would offer similar types of returns in terms of the teams that they play with. So I went with Pukki and I went with Vardy. So they offer a similar type of attacking threat. They also, when I looked at the stats, had a similar number of shots. So Pukki had 80 shots, and Vardy, I think, had 89 over the season. Similar number of games. The big difference, though, was Vardy was converting more of his chances. Now we could easily go, oh, well, he's got more Premier League experience. He might know some of the keepers. His pace might be a contributing factor. the big one is, he's finishing more on his left side versus Pukki. He's a more well-rounded player. He's scoring with his head. Physically he's a bit bigger. But you've got to start to look at how he's getting a similar number of chances, but he's converting double. Why is that? And we can't look at the data in isolation. And you can then start to use video clips, but data does lead you towards saying, if there is an issue, we need to start designing practices that are relevant for the types of chances that we're creating. So if Norwich are creating a certain type of chance, and only a few of them, potentially they're getting 3 on target and scoring less than a goal per game, then maybe they need more finishing work than they potentially need defensive work or build-up play work. So I started to have a look at Vardy types of players, Pukki types of players in action. What did it look like when it comes to a match day, and gathering some information and data. So these were taken over a weekend just gone. You'll recognize some of the scores on there. But the conversion rates were staggering when you look at some of the best players in the league. So Arsenal, we've got a team full of internationals. You've got Liverpool there. That's a decent return in terms of percentage wise, in terms of being able to win things or win games. 12 point, anything over sort of 10 to 10.5% is enough normally to win you a game when it comes to conversion rates. But there are some where you would look at and you go, that is unbelievably low. So teams like Newcastle, 5.2%. So these were just taken over one games, real short snippets. So I started to have a look at the comparative data. I got all of the information from the Premier League in terms of a variety of clubs, and I'll share with you the spreadsheet in a little while. But I started to go through, well, Arsenal's overall conversion rate was around 11.1. So they've got a decent return on the number of shots that they're taking in terms of goals. City, again, decent return, but surprisingly Manchester United was a little bit higher in terms of the return for shots to goals. So they're creating a number of chances, but they're actually putting them away at a decent rate. And I said this was before City scored a few the other day. It's Brighton, that's West Brom, there's Fulham, staggering. And then the last one is Sheffield United, which you will see is unbelievably poor, which is why they are where they are. So Sheffield United is effectively relegation material, and Fulham's is arguably not far off. Brighton and West Brom, they should be looking at doing something if they want to stay in the league. They need to work on their finishing if they want to stay in the league, because they're creating some chances, as all teams seem to do in these games. They're getting shots on target, or the majority of them are getting shots on target. They're just not putting them away. So the question needs to be asked, well, why is the pass completion rate so high for so many of these players, but the shot conversion rate is so low for so many of these players? And the simple argument is practices that are being used in training sessions, they're not getting enough repetition in order to be able to score enough goals. Like I said, finishing sessions for strikers, if you look at the number of passes that they would make over a week versus the number of finishes that a striker would make, there would be a huge disparity. But yet we're talking about people whose job it is not necessarily to pass the ball, but we will talk about role profiles in a minute. But the striker's job is to score the goals, the same as the goalkeeper's job is to keep the ball out. So if you look at the number of passes a goalkeeper would make versus the number of shots that they would save with their hands, proportionately they would save a lot more. With their isolated one-to-one work or in small group work, they'd be doing loads and loads of shot stopping work and handling work versus kicking the ball and distributing the ball with their hands and feet. But the balance is shifted well away from our outfield centre forward players or our wide forward players or our 10s that might link play in terms of the pass to shot, pass to finish ratio. So in terms of a concept, I then came up with an idea of what does all this information mean? Because that's an important bit. And I've said it many, many times, but it's great. We've got all this data. There's loads of data out there. But what does it mean? Now, I use a model that I've broken down, and it sort of came from discussions with Dick Bate around the areas of the game, the areas of individual development. And I label it the MAP model. Some of you will have seen some of this sort of stuff before. But I look at every player within my team as being a line on the London Underground, if you like. And there are times when they intersect with other people. Those relationships are really important because that's where we connect. But every one of those sort of stations on that line might be a developmental need for my player, or for that player within the role and function of the team. So I need to make sure if we do stop at that station, I'm going to make sure that we service it properly. So I'm going to give you an example of one player, and we'll pick one player from here, and we'll call the player Arsenal as an example here, purely because I'm an Arsenal fan. So when we start to look at it, what we have is we have individual attributes that come into it. We have their movements and the amount of time that is dedicated to physical conditioning in professional football is unbelievable. Not just physical conditioning, but the rest that goes on as well, in between rest and recovery. The resources that go into it, the strength and conditioning, the influence that those guys would have on training load, etc. I'll get to actions in a minute, but the other bit that gets a lot of attention is the principles. So the stuff around the team, how the team is going to play. The bit that we don't really cover in too much detail is the bit around the individual actions. In the elite environments, individuals are not coached in the same level of depth that they potentially need to be coached. So my argument here is we should be looking at more focus around individual actions, especially with forward players, and potentially breaking it down into what I would label as my map. So this is my map that I use, and I use this for all different things. One of it's around runs, how you might lose a defender. And if I was to sort of highlight some things in there, or some ways to use it, you can use it to determine or to showcase different ways to finish or different ways to move with the players that you might be working with. So an example might be in, some of you would have seen some of these, so I'll give you an example of the scoop shot. So I'll just share with you the scoop shot. Some of you would have seen some of the, and then you'll see Ronaldo's one in a second where it's almost with the outside of the foot, whereas Suka's one was maybe with the toe, sort of dinking it with the toe. But not too often do we see those types of finishes happen in games. Sometimes they happen in training sessions, but I don't see coaches too often coach this technique. And it's something that I would urge people to consider moving forward, because not only do the goals look good, but they are actually effective. And there are a variety of different methods that we can use when it comes to finishing. And I've got my own sort of 11 S's that I use more often than not. So I'll go back to that one, and I'll share with you a different one. So if you went to somebody like Mesut Ozil, who's really good at striking the ball into the ground, again, I don't see too many coaches coaching this technique as a finish. And by that I mean ball moving away from you, ball could be moving towards you, it can be stationary, it can be in the air, almost like a half volley where you're deliberately striking it into the ground, or even a volley where you deliberately hit downwards on top of the ball. So there's a Ozil playing a pass that you'll see here. So he plays a pass deliberately into the ground, and he also operates some shots on goal, striking the ball down. So there are a variety of different techniques. That ball coming across, so ball moving across you with the opposite foot. And I mentioned that, so he uses right foot because therefore he had a bigger angle of the goal. So it's real intelligent finishing, ball moving away from you at speed. But not too often are these techniques coached, but they are learned. And my contention is, at the elite level, when you're talking about the best players, why on earth would you leave that to chance? Why on earth are you leaving your Premier League survival, millions of pounds, down to hoping that your forwards can finish rather than stepping in and actually helping them get better? Taking away the free kick time, where evidence suggests it's very ineffective and the returns are very minimal for the amount of time that goes into it. Try different things where the evidence suggests you're going to be able to get maximum returns in terms of the area, the pitch geography, and then try different techniques that you might be able to use to be able to maximize the returns or types of chances that you create as a team. So in terms of what that would mean moving forward, there are a variety of things that I can share with you. So one of them is around the types of practice that you might use within your session. So if you play with a solo striker, an individual forward, well, what do your practices look like that might help that? that individual get better. So there's a variety of practices that you potentially could use. So I'm just going to share one with you. So that one there is one of my favorites. So for example, if I'm a forward playing in this session, I could be working on, receiving the ball back to goal in a real tight area, against a centre half, 1v1, maybe 6 yards, 6 to 10 yards from goal tops. The other end, I could be a centre forward that, plays on my own up front, but I like to offer the threat of running in behind. Now, too often when we talk about, we want to develop creative players, well, in our sessions, we're not being creative with how we set things up. Too often what we see is mirrored practices. So at one end, you have exactly the same size zone as you do at the other end, but it might not necessarily meet the demands or meet the needs of the player that you've got. So the players in context that was mentioned earlier. So can you be creative with your session design, especially if you're talking about working with a single forward? You could then be really creative and make it really tough, and maybe stick a second defender in there, because then it might be much more closer to what would happen on a match day. Again, you can be as creative as you like. This is just me working with some ideas around having an individual player that you might potentially work with, depending on their abilities or role within the team. So if you wanted someone who was going to offer the threat to run in behind, this might be a practice, or you might have a squad where you've got somebody like Giroud in there who's going to hold the ball up, and maybe a different Chelsea forward who likes to make the runs in behind, maybe like Tammy Abraham, who's not going to be your back to goal centre forward. But in one practice, by setting it up creatively, both of your forwards who might play as lone strikers are going to get returns from the practice. So that's the idea behind using something like that. And again, you can animate stuff so that players can bring it to life. So there are some differences that you can potentially use, or different tools you can use in terms of bringing your sessions to life. The last bit really that I wanted to talk to you about, or share a concept with you around, was player profiles and sort of job descriptions for players. So loads of time we talk about roles and responsibilities within the team. And it is really important that we start to break it down. Well, what does it actually look like? What does it mean? So these are some of the elements that you might consider within your team. These are only some of them. So you've also got, forwards out of possession that you might start to look at, and breaking things down into more depth, and giving players constant feedback rather than leaving things to chance, and making it really clear what their job is. Now, so I could go in and talk about this player here. So this is your number 9. That job description there is on an academy wall. I won't name the academy. Some of you will potentially know who it is. But that is the job description that's on the wall in the academy. And they've got job descriptions for every single position on the walls. My contention is that's a lot of information for the player to be able to remember. It's a lot of information for me to be able to communicate, before the game around their individual targets, maybe at halftime or post-game and a debrief, or asking them to feedback. So taking some of Dick Bates' great work, and I will keep mentioning it because it's an unbelievable resource if you ever get the chance to purchase it. How can you make it simpler without making it simple? So taking all that information, all I'm going to ask my striker to do is make sure you keep the ball, so we can bring other players into play. Secure possession. Don't try and think too outrageous and fancy when it's not on. If you then get the chance to shoot, have a go to shoot. If you can't shoot, can you move it at your feet? Can you dribble it? Can you do something that's going to allow you to get a shot in? If you can't do that, can you set someone else up? Can you supply somebody? And after that, make a run, support the attack. And if we lose it, shut them down. Or if we can't shut them down and apply direct pressure, can we then support the defense and fill in? So that's one way of taking the previous long job description and making it easy to remember when it comes to the players that you work with. And I've got a few of them. So that's the number 10 from the same academy. As an example, I've just changed the letter. So I've said, look, this is what I want you to do. You're my number 10. Get in between their units, get in between their lines, make it difficult so they've got to come out and play. Be a goal threat. That might mean go for a long shot. It might mean go for a little dribble. It might mean that you've got to give it to somebody else who's ahead of you, maybe the 9. And at times, get ahead of the 9, get beyond them. And if we lose it, get it back. And if you can't get it back, give some cover. So really simple bits of information that you can communicate easily with your players so they know what their job is in and out of possession when it comes to, any level of the game. Because even at the elite level, they're still not going to want a long-winded approach to what their job description is. You know, adults are going to want you to just tell them what it is that you want them to do. So those are some of the concepts. Now, this is the bit where I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to sort of put you guys into breakout rooms and say, look, these are some of the ideas, the concepts. You've seen some of the data. The question now is, well, so what? For you, that's a really important bit. So what? What could you potentially do with the information? What could you take away and use within your environment to make your forwards more effective? That is the one question that everybody should be looking at moving forward. You've had some examples of practices you potentially could use. You know, if you play with 2 strikers, well, what does that mean in terms of your practice design? What does it mean in terms of, you know, areas that you might be able to score from? Because, you know, if you play with a front 3, you've already seen, and you've got the stats that would back it up, but only 2% of goals were scored from the areas where you look at Mahrez was cutting in from, or Salah was cutting in from. So that is not a huge percentage area in terms of scoring direct from there. However, if you've got that player that can then get inside the box, the chances go up massively. And that's what you'll see. So Bale's done it in recent weeks from that side of the pitch, being left-footed. Mahrez, another one. Rafinha's done one. So there's a few players that you'll be able to identify that have scored some goals. Opposite foot players cutting into the inside the box that score, but outside the box, they don't really tend to get too many goals in return. So those are some of the bits of information that hopefully you found relatively useful. So the question I'm going to pose to you now is, well, so what? In your breakout rooms, I'm going to give you 20 minutes to go off and discuss it. I'm going to put you in small groups of 4 or 5, and it'd be really interesting I'm going to jump into different rooms and just listen to some ideas around what does all that information mean and how you could potentially use some of the data, because the data might confirm that what you're doing is correct. And you might be doing loads of practices that are geared towards working with forwards finishing 1 and 2 touch inside the penalty area in central zones, and not necessarily wasting or using loads of time taking free kicks outside the area. The other bit is it might challenge what you're currently doing, and it might even change what you currently do. Watch Arsenal, the amount of chances they create from finishing. I would love to go in and work with their players on finishing from balls coming across you, because of the returns that I feel I could get with a group of Arsenal players doing some isolated work with them, because Saka misses so many chances. And that's the other bit to consider, is it's not just about forwards when you look at data and numbers or position specific coaching for forwards. If you look across the league at where the most shots are coming from in terms of each team, Manchester United is Fernandes, Arsenal is Saka. Who else did we have? De Bruyne at Manchester City. So although we often associate goal scoring or shots with centre forwards or players that are playing in those areas, it's often not always the one who's playing right in the middle, right by the goal. They often have another role to do within the team, another role to maybe create space for shots or to link play in there. So your practices potentially could include roles and functions for players that are joining in from midfield, if you're talking about converting the shots to goals ratio.